Welcome. I'm Dr. Greg Bergner. I've been a doctor in Tahoe for over 40 years, and I want to talk to you about something important: choices and marijuana. I'm going to spend a few moments talking about what it is, what it looks like, and how it can affect you. And the main reason I'm taking the time to do this is because using marijuana in younger years can affect your later life. But first, let's look at what marijuana looks like. This is what marijuana looks like. The picture on the left is the leaves, and the flowers and the seeds are on the right. The leaves, flowers, and seed contain hundreds of chemical compounds, but two are most important. And the two compounds are THC and CBD. THC is what we're going to talk about today because it's the substance which gives users the feeling of being high. So as we move on, if I mention the effects that marijuana has on the body, I'm talking about THC. And I want you to know that the legal age to use marijuana is the same as legal age to use alcohol. It's 21 years old. It's illegal to use it before that time. And you'll see why in a minute, but you need to know that you can be arrested if you're caught using marijuana before age 21. So let's look at where marijuana works. The main effects of THC or marijuana are on the brain, and there are effects on the heart and other organs too. We saw that marijuana is a plant, so you might wonder, how does it get into the body? Well, it gets into the body by people drying the leaves, then smoking them, or vaping the oils, or eating foods made with it, or by making it into a tea. But once it gets into the body, THC works especially on the brain. And it does this by attaching or binding to receptors on nerve cells in our brains. And when THC binds there to these receptors, it affects how the cells work. These receptors are most concentrated in areas of the brain that regulate movement and coordination, learning and memory, and the higher brain functions like judgment, pleasure, anxiety, and depression. So THC binds to receptors on the ends of nerve cells, and the binding alters how these nerve cells work. Sounds pretty simple, but let's look a little closer. The top drawing is a single nerve called a neuron, and it looks like a tree, but it's just one neuron. And the black branches of the cell gather information from the connections with the other nerve cells and sensors. And all of these branches are there to gather input. And this input is like data, which then flows to the black oval structure at the bottom, which is the main part of the nerve cell. And that main part transfers the signals out through a single route, which is the one going down towards the right in that top picture. And then the second picture is a blow-up drawing of the end of just one of those black branches in the top picture. The magnified branch is the orangish colored part in the center, and the single orange branch connects not to just one, but to several other nerves, which are the yellow cup-like structures. And by attaching to so many, things become very complex very quickly. Groups of these connections become organized into pathways called neural networks, which are often specialized for certain functions. And having robust networks and fully connected nerve cells is important. We want our nerve cells to be well connected so that they can help us gather data to make good decisions. Toxic stresses or exposure to drugs like THC can blunt or impair the formation of the connections in your nerve cells. So let's move on to the brain and its development. It takes the first 25 years of your life for the brain to fully form and establish the connections to the networks that we've been talking about. During this first 25 years, we say that your brain is plastic. That means it's bendable, moldable. It can grow pathways which lead in some directions, but not others, or vice versa. The point is, it develops in response to what it's exposed to. To give you an idea of just how complex this is, at birth, you're born with 100 billion neurons in your brain, and that's over 10 times more than the total number of humans on the entire planet, and as many as there are stars in our galaxy. And if that weren't enough, at birth, each one of our 100 billion nerves is connected to 2,500 other neurons or sensors. Now, 100 billion is a huge number, but when you take that 100 billion and you multiply it by 2,500 connections, it becomes beyond our comprehension. And that was at birth. By the age of 3, our single nerve cell, which started out connected to 2,500 others, can now be connected to 15,000 other nerve cells and sensors. And that would be enough connections to connect every man, woman, and child in the entire south shore of Lake Tahoe. And that's for only one of the 100 billion neurons we're born with. And like I said, these connections become organized into networks. And the first of our networks to form are the visual networks. When babies are born, they can't see well because their visual networks are still immature. But with time and stimulation, these visual networks develop, and then the baby's eyesight gradually improves until they can see as good as you and I by age 6 months. And as the visual networks are developing, the networks for language are also forming to allow speech as babies grow older. There are lots more networks, but I think you get the idea. Our plastic brain develops networks in response to what they're exposed to. So we don't want to expose our brains to things which may be harmful. After age 25, our brains lose some of that plasticity. Our brains can still change, but not as easily and not on the same scale that they were able to change when we were younger. So that's the background. Marijuana has a number of effects, but the most important effects are on the brain. And CAT scans and MRIs show that chronic THC exposure causes structural changes in the developing brain. Some studies suggest it may even reduce your IQ, but more studies need to be done before we're sure of that. THC can aggravate or cause depression and anxiety, and it can decrease your motivation to learn, or to work, or to be a part of a family. And as I mentioned, we don't yet know everything there is to know about marijuana. Scientists are still studying its effects, and it appears to be especially harmful if the marijuana is smoked, because in addition to THC, you're exposing sensitive lung tissues to chemicals which have just been combusted, and we know that most of these combusted chemicals are harmful. So I think it might help you grasp all of this by thinking of our developing brains like the construction of a Ferris wheel. If you're at a carnival and a guy is putting a Ferris wheel together, you want him to use every bolt that's supposed to be in there. You don't want him to get to the end, discover he has a few bolts left over, so he simply tosses them out. Well, the same thing with the brain. You want to make sure all your bolts, your connections, and your networks are where they're supposed to be, and that they're secure. Don't expose your developing brain to marijuana. You don't want to be the one missing a few bolts or having incomplete networks. So my message on marijuana is wait. Don't expose your brain to something which might harm it, or something which can keep you from being at your best. Your brain's too important to risk having that happen. And that brings us back to choices, your choices. I encourage each of you to think about this. Make sure the choices you make are your choices, not someone else's. Just because someone you know uses marijuana doesn't mean you should let that influence your decision. Make sure your choices are based upon truth, not something you might hear from a friend or read on the internet or hear from someone who's trying to sell you something. Make choices which are going to provide you with the best options and the best opportunities for your future. Remember, you are the one ultimately in charge. Having all of us work at our top is important for the future of us all. We want all of you to be active parts of that future, so make wise choices. Thank you for listening.